For the past 150 years, this weathered tombstone has stood silently in a small cemetery in the mountains of Appalachia. It's the only reminder of a remarkable man that's been long forgotten. Today, one would never suspect the incredible forgotten story and the lingering mystery that is buried here. It's nearly been lost to the hands of time. And like so many other stories on this channel, it's never been told to our generation until now. Buckle up for the astonishing true story of George Cunningham. Our story begins in the middle of a snowstorm in the winter of 1855 on the banks of Cane Creek in Fletcher, North Carolina. It's here that George Cunningham was born. Now, the Cunningham name was respected by everyone who lived in this area. They were honest, hard-working folks. Yet, these were turbulent times in America's history. And by the time George was 6 years old, his father was one of the thousands of men who felt the call of duty to serve their nation that they loved so much. So he volunteered to fight in the bloody war between the states. And within a few short months, he was killed in battle. And so it was, George had to become the man of the house at an early age to help his mother survive. By 9 years old, the mountain boy was hired out for months at a time as an apprentice for local craftsmen in the area. But George never complained, and by all accounts, folks in Henderson County admired his personality as well as his dependable work ethic. Now, this area was still largely isolated from the rest of America. No railroads or roads had penetrated the thick forest or the jagged bluffs. Mail only came about once a month, and that was during the good weather, and most folks had never seen or heard of store-bought goods. The closest town was Asheville, just 15 miles away as the crow flies, but it would take a solid week for a man and his mule to make the dangerous journey, one way through the narrow gorges and slippery rocks, overlooking rushing rivers hundreds of feet below. One single false step would send a traveler crashing down the boulders into the foaming waters. For this reason, most folks avoided traveling those rocky paths that were really little more than animal trails at all costs. In fact, it was common for folks who lived here to never venture out more than 10 miles away from their home during their entire lifetimes. But George had grown up here in these mountains, and by the age of 16, he was as fearless as any full-grown man. And he knew the path to Asheville like the back of his hand. It was then that he began his career, hauling wagon loads of corn, wheat, rye, and apples down from the rural farms to the city. And on his return trip, he would transport mail and manufactured goods back to the only general store Fletcher had. The loaded carts were pulled by a team of 6 to 8 work mules up the treacherous, steep mountains, and it was dangerous, slow, and a grueling task to transport the valuable cargo. Nonetheless, the stout mountaineer embraced the challenge and was making good money, sometimes $5 a week. For the next 3 years, George Cunningham traveled the road over the mountain whenever the weather conditions were fair enough. And since it was the only path over the mountain, other travelers from faraway lands like Tennessee or Kentucky, or even merchants peddling the latest miracle cure snake oil, would sometimes happen by. And each day at sunset, George found himself in the company of vagabonds and nomads who had pulled off the road to camp for the night. There, they would gather around a campfire and exchange news from the outside world, while a jug of powerful corn whiskey was passed around. They'd spend the night talking or playing cards, and sometimes a fellow might even have a fiddle or a guitar, and they would sing ballads of outlaws who had escaped from the law, or for their love of the gal who was waiting for them back home. Anything to pass the night away in the cool mountain air underneath the stars. After a long week on the trail, Asheville was always a sight for sore eyes. George would spend the day enjoying the spectacle of city folks gathered in the shops and bustling down the main streets in buggies dressed in their finest clothes. He would drop off his load that he had brought from the farms and then proceed to fill his wagon with all the store-bought goods he could pile on it. Asheville was always full of folks traveling from the outside world, and it was here that he met a man named Daniel Sternberg, a man from Ottawa, Kansas, who had been in the area for a few weeks looking to purchase a large tract of land for mica mining. Mr. Sternberg approached George and inquired about him carrying his suitcases and surveying tools over the mountain for him, since he had a bit of empty space on the wagon. And being the cunning mountaineer that he was, George agreed to transport him for the sum of $1.50. But he made it clear that Mr. Sternberg would have to walk behind the wagon up that steep mountain, because George didn't want to take a chance on overloading his mules. The two men shook hands, and on the morning of June 6, 1874, they set out on their journey across the mountain. But little did either man know that fate was about to forever change both their lives. And what happens next has baffled historians to this very day. With a deal struck, George Cunningham and the stranger from Kansas, Daniel Sternberg, set out that morning on the steep climb up and over the wall of jagged mountains leading to Hendersonville. The summer sun was especially hot as they spent the entire morning and afternoon climbing, and by sunset they were within a mile of the summit when they decided to set up camp next to the Swananoa River for the evening. And as darkness fell, the two men began passing around a bottle of white whiskey. Back and forth it went. Mr. Sternberg then produced a deck of playing cards from his overcoat pocket. At first, they played for fun, before the city slicker suggested that they wager some money to make it a little more interesting. But you see, what he didn't know was that old George knew every trick and sleight of hand trick that there was when it came to cards. And before long, he had taken all of the Kansas man's money. Now, Mr. Sternberg was furious. He had lost nearly $15, and he demanded one last hand as he put up his gold watch as his wager. A moment later, George had won the watch too. Both men were nearly drunk, and Sternberg stormed to his feet. "You cheat! You're a cheating scoundrel!" he stormed. But those were fighting words in the hills, and an instant later, Sternberg had picked up a maple stick and was swinging it at George's head. Stumbling backwards, the mountain man fell into the side of his wagon, and in an act of defense, he grabbed the axe that just happened to be within reach. Without even thinking, George swung the weapon and hit Sternberg squarely in the face, causing him to drop to the ground. Dizzy from the blows and the alcohol, George fell to the ground and passed out. However, when George awoke in the morning, he began preparations to resume travel when he noticed that Sternberg was still sleeping. So he walked over and rolled the city man over, only to realize he was dead. George was suddenly gripped with a sickening fear. No one would ever believe him if they told him what happened. Surely he would hang for this. The only thing he could do was try and conceal the body. So he dragged Sternberg down towards the river, and as he was pulling his body, 2 rolls of money fell from his coat pockets. George picked it up and counted it. $600. He had never seen that much money in his life. Suddenly, the entire situation had spiraled out of control when George made another bad decision and left Mr. Sternberg's body on the side of the river and took the $600 and left. A few miles down the trail, he got nervous about having that much cash, so he hid it in the hollow of a chestnut tree just off the road. A few days went by when a hunter was walking the banks of the Swananoa River when all of a sudden he heard his hunting dogs in the distance barking strangely. And when the hunter arrived, he realized that his dogs had found the body of Daniel Sternberg. Wagging tongues quickly spread the news of the wealthy businessman's death, and soon authorities realized that the last person he was seen with was George Cunningham. And when the lawmen arrived at George's farm, he still had Sternberg's watch in his pocket. Just like that, George Cunningham was arrested and would stand trial for the murder of Daniel Sternberg.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling today. 2 volumes that'll make your heart smile. Click the link below or visit the appalachianstoryteller.com to order your copies today.
At the trial, George told the court exactly what happened. He never meant to kill the man. It was self-defense, and he had just panicked and left the body there. Even when authorities arrested him, he never denied the charge, and he told them too exactly what had happened. However, his fate now rested in the hands of a jury of his peers, and when they returned with their verdict, the head juror read this statement aloud. George Cunningham, you have been convicted by a jury of your countrymen of the highest crime known to common law. You willingly murdered a highly accomplished and elegant gentleman, a traveler and a stranger who had entrusted himself to your care as a guide, and you left him in a watery grave. Your hasty flight from the ghastly presence of your deed and your possession of your victim's pocket watch are proof of your crime. It is now my sad and painful duty to inform you that you must suffer the extreme penalty of the law. All of the places that you have known will soon be no more, and the tall bended grass that covers your grave will be the only thing that weeps over your last lonely resting place. It is the judgment of the court that George Cunningham be taken into the custody of the sheriff, and on the 6th day of November, between the hours of 12 and 1 o'clock, he shall be hanged by the neck until he is dead. May God have mercy upon his soul. George would appeal his case all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court, but in the end, the verdict was upheld. And on May 28, 1875, the day of judgment finally arrived. The crime had been the talk for months, and all the hill folk were there in a carnival-like atmosphere surrounding the jail where Cunningham was held. 1,500 folks had traveled from the surrounding counties on horse, wagons, and even on foot to see the big event for themselves. And when the church bell sounded at the 12 o'clock hour, the jail door opened as a hush fell over the crowd. The sheriff led the prisoner out, shackled in chains, followed by a preacher holding a Bible and a deputy holding a double-barrel shotgun. The condemned man was allowed to make one last final speech, where he maintained that he was only acting in self-defense before he was led through the crowd into a 20-foot by 30-foot pen that was enclosed by a 15-foot wooden fence to conceal the final moments. An ominous hush fell over the crowd as they listened carefully to the preacher read a couple verses. And a few moments later, the rope was cut and George Cunningham was pronounced dead. The gates to the gallows were opened and 2 horses emerged, pulling a wagon and a pine coffin as its cargo. It made its way through the crowd and then disappeared down a dusty trail bound for Fletcher, North Carolina, a 2 days ride where George's family would bury him. Now, it was the custom in those days to open the coffin one final time before burial, but because it had been nearly 3 days since his death, and in the blazing summer, the family decided not to open the coffin. And there, in Patty's Chapel Cemetery, George Cunningham was laid to rest. Or was he? You see, George's body wasn't even cold before talk started among those who witnessed the hanging. One witness claimed that he could see through a small hole in the wooden fence that surrounded the gallows, and he claimed that when a rope was cut and George fell, that his toes were actually touching the ground. In that moment, the doctor shouted, "He's dead," and they placed him in a coffin. Other rumors started that a mile down the road, the wagon that was carrying the coffin stopped to water the horses. And then the top of the coffin sprang open and George disappeared into the woods. Folks claimed that an oak log was then placed in the coffin and buried 3 days later. As outrageous as it sounded, the rumor continued to grow for decades. Many claimed that George Cunningham changed his name and then started a new life out in Oklahoma. This couldn't be true. Surely it was a myth. Just an old legend, right? Well, in 1959, 84 years after his death, 17 descendants of George's family, who were mostly nieces and nephews, petitioned the North Carolina government for permission to dig up George's grave. And you won't believe what they found. On July 7th, 1959, underneath the blazing heat of the midday sun, a group of nearly 20 farmers and Dr. David Pierce, a chemistry professor at Asheville and Biltmore College, began the task of settling, once and for all, the mystery of George Cunningham. Working in 5-minute shifts, the men dug their shovels into the earth before passing the tool to the next man. Deeper and deeper they dug, until they reached the lid of the coffin, and at that point, they began carefully digging with their hands, examining every piece of evidence. There were the handles of the coffin. Dr. Pierce cut them with his pocket knife. "Those are made of walnut," he proclaimed. Then he examined the remains of the lid. "The coffin is made of pine," he stated. And for 2 hours, the men excavated the grave, but not one single human hair, tooth, or bone, not even a shred of clothing could be found. The only thing that was in the grave was a glass bottle of cologne, which was common during those days to mask the smell of a corpse. Dr. Pierce then climbed into the grave to give it a thorough examination. The only thing that was in it was a large amount of oak wood and bark. There was no evidence of a human ever being in this grave, and the overwhelming evidence was that it was filled with an oak log. George Cunningham escaped the gallows and had disappeared, never to be seen again. But how did he do it? How could he convince the sheriff and those officials in attendance to just let him go? Did you guess how? Well, you remember that $600 that he hid in the tree? Well, it was never found or mentioned again. Now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.